Now, were you at the Audubon office in Philly?
Yeah,
It
I
was.
was there and I was working for Donna at the same time.
Oh, cool. That's great.
Busy, busy.
Busy, busy, busy. Okay, and we're live. Cool beans. So we had a little hang up there, but hey, folks, welcome, welcome, welcome to another special episode of our Facebook Live Franklin Outside series. I, of course, am Dr. Rachel Valletta, your environmental scientist with the Franklin Institute, and I am joined today by a second-time guest, and we'll get to his introduction in just a moment, but I do want to note that he is the first guest I've brought back for a second-time conversation. We had much more to unpack when we last spoke in summer of 2020, and today Mr. James will be helping us think a little bit about some pressing topics in the environment and climate change spheres. So without further ado, let me introduce Tykee James. Tykee is the Government Affairs Coordinator with the National Audobon Society. He's an experienced environmental educator, community organizer, and policy advisor. He hosts several podcasts, including Word on Wildlife. I recommend you all check it out if you're interested in the environmental sciences. He hits on science topics, policy topics, community topics, and of course, wildlife topics. And today he's going to be helping us think through some emerging policy issues and conversations that are coming to the forefront in the federal policy landscape as it pertains to environment and climate change. So, Tykee, welcome back. So good to have you. We had you last summer when we were talking about the at the time we were talking about Black Birders event. It was right on the heels of course, the BLM protests, and it's good to have you back. We said at that time that we wanted to unpack more. So thank you for joining us again.
Well, I'm really happy to be here. I'm very appreciative of the introduction, and it's nice. It's nice making history as the first two-time guest. I hope everybody can also aspire to such accomplishments.
Well, thanks for forging that road with us. Before we dive into our conversation here, we had chatted. It might be good to give our audience a little bit of a primer, because this isn't necessarily a topic that we delve into so much, but it is pretty much commonplace now to see in the environment and climate conversations. So we wanted to give you all sort of a quick dip into the deep end on these topics, and then we'll get into our conversation with Tykee. And so before we do that, let's set the stage. Usually, of course, on this program, I'm discussing topics in the environmental sciences or as it pertains to climate change. True enough, these are my areas of technical expertise. I'd like to think. And when it comes to explaining and unpacking racial justice issues, I'm just a committed student. But where and when these two things intersect, and let's recognize they do nearly everywhere, all the time, it's really important to highlight those connections, because our science doesn't live in a vacuum. It's not immune to social or political factors. At best, scientific advancements can help us address the environmental and climate crises that I'm so commonly talking about. I believe that they can and that they will if they're implemented with care. And improving environmental conditions and taking action on climate change must benefit all of us, everyone, particularly those communities that have borne the brunt of historical pollution and environmental degradation wrought by others. And that brings us really, really nicely, I think, into the conversation here. Again, Tykee, I mentioned that we had you last on in the summer 2020, right on the heels of Black Lives Matter protests. And those protests, we now know, of course, have fueled a national conversation on racial equity and racial justice. And they find those topics find themselves at the center of climate and environment issues now. Okay, so help us understand, from your view on the world, why is that? And help us understand why it's important to center these issues of racial equity and justice at the heart of environment and climate work, when we don't typically think of those two things as married.
Right. And this is a really great question, because what we're really talking about is going beyond putting equity, diversity, and inclusion plans in your strategic plan, or making a special committee for it as a measure of success. What we're talking about is how we need to achieve environmental progress. And we can only achieve that by being grounded in advancing racial justice and social equity. I think that the organizations of yesteryear, even the ones that have lasted for over 100 or so years, have upheld a status quo that have separated those things, that have made it, beneficial only to those who have money and only to those who are white. And those who are burdened with the disadvantage of environmental blight often and intentionally aren't put in positions to solve that blight. So when we talk about achieving environmental conservation, it needs to be grounded in racial justice and advancing social equity for future generations. And this means that you're going to have to transform. If you're at an organization that is wondering how to do that, you have to know that this means you're going to have to transform the way you fundraise. At the very core, a lot of what that means is changing how you fundraise. And one suggestion I have for looking at how you want to fundraise differently, I would check out communitycentricfundraising.org. They have a list of principles and essays, and I actually have a podcast episode on there where I cover interpersonal philanthropy and whether that has space in advancing equity in this movement. But on the topic of money, putting more money into environmental justice organizations, it may be nice, but generosity will never be a substitute for justice. And so all of the work that we do in this movement needs to be grounded in racial justice and advancing social equity.
Right. So speaking a bit to the why, as you were sort of wrapping up there, I love that line. Generosity will never be a substitute for justice. Did I get that right?
Yeah, never. It'll never be.
I think that's powerful, and of course, speaking to where power lies is in finance. But let's get to that organizational conversation in just a minute, and expand a little bit on that why statement I mentioned. I have a couple of factoids here, and the list is long, but you mentioned there the term environmental justice. So let's help our audience first understand what is environmental justice. So the US EPA, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, defines environmental justice like this. Okay, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, all people should be able to enjoy two things. One, the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards. And two, equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Other activist organizations go further to describe a healthy environment in which we live, learn, work, play, and pray. And I really like that expanded definition because I think it hits on the deep humanity of this issue and
Right.
so some of the heritage and cultural aspects
and it rhymes.
that are tied up in this, and it rhymes, so it's easy for us to remember. But the list of environmental injustices is quite long. Are there any that are particularly top for you that come to mind that can help our audience sort of very easily understand and really feel what an environmental injustice is?
So one story I used to tell is how I came back to Philly for my senior year in high school, where I was born in Philly, and when I was born in Philly, I was also born with asthma. I then moved, maybe at a very young age, 4 or 5 or something, to California, Wisconsin, Texas. Never had an asthma issue. Never. And I was in sports, it just never really came up. And it wasn't until I came back to Philly that I almost had a cardiac arrest because I was having an asthma attack for about 2 weeks on end, not thinking it was an asthma attack. I was just thinking that I was just breathing heavy because I was breathing heavy. And knowing how quickly air quality can affect my lungs, and my lungs started in the city of Philadelphia, was very clear. And also where I lived too. I was living in West Philly at the time, but the bottom in Mantua. And knowing that is often the stories of communities that are fence line to polluters, and knowing that there have been a history of decisions that have redlined where these communities live, where these environmental hazards go, where environmental resources go instead, and where environmental resources are extracted. All of these decisions are made so that Tykee, young Black man having an asthma attack in the city of Philadelphia, is another, drop in the bucket of asthma related ER calls, and the issue or what environmental justice does bring is a lot of intersectionality, because now we're talking about access to healthcare. Because I didn't have a doctor, I had to go to the ER, and I'm glad I did, because yeah, again, I almost had a cardiac arrest.
Um,
And then when you couple the public health effects of environmental degradation, you can see that there are communities, there are zip codes, and race has been a determining factor in where environmental burdens go. Um, and it's really unfortunate that we haven't, in Pennsylvania, legitimized Article 1, Section 27 of the state constitution, that
yes.
is Pennsylvania's environmental right amendment, which, in short, allows the government, or it authorizes, it mandates that the government acts as a trustee of our natural resources, of the scenic beauty of the Commonwealth, so that people can enjoy it. Like, simple as that. So people can play and pray and do all the things in the month of May, like watch birds if they may. That's part of our cultural heritage, but also important for ecological production.
Mm. Yeah, you hit on so many cross-cutting issues there, and I want to break it down for our audience that might be a little bit less familiar with maybe some of the social aspects or some of the policy aspects here. But before I do that, I want to highlight, you mentioned the state constitution of Pennsylvania. Most folks don't know this and are surprised to learn that Pennsylvania does have engendered in its constitution a clause that, and I'm paraphrasing here, says that we have, as Pennsylvanians, a right to clean air and water and land. And that means then that we can take legal action when we don't have access to those things. And so we'll sort of, try and keep the legal conversation light here.
Right.
That's certainly not an area that I can speak too deeply on, but it does get at the fact that environmental regulation matters, and we have to have access equally to how environmental regulation is spread, and when it is non-regulated, and there are sort of negative impacts of polluters, that each community has the ability equally to combat that. Okay. And so I just want to hit on a couple big topics that Tykee just brought up there. So we heard about his personal anecdote of asthma, and that's a really scary personal experience. Thank you for sharing that, Tykee. And that's emblematic, unfortunately, of a lot of communities, frontline communities in particular. And so a frontline community, Tykee, do you want to explain that for our audience?
Absolutely. So I like the term frontline community, because it is hitting on folks that are directly facing, the brunt and the burden of environmental hazards. But with a Fenceline community, that's a term that was I originally became familiar with when I was working with State Representative Donna Bullock. There was a published report that with NAACP, I believe the Clean Air Council as well, talked about the public health effects of where zip codes, where people, by zip code, where people are, and where polluter emissions are. Where there are. I forgot the name of the type of factories that they were looking at, but I'd be happy to share the report. But what it shows is there are regulations that say if you want to be a factory that's going to pollute, you have to fill out a permit to pollute. And when you fill out that permit, and I'm the government, you want this permit, well, I'm going to pick where you go. And I'm going to pick a place that I think is of least value. I'm going to pick a place that I think won't affect people. And often that the answering of those questions lead to the toxin, it leads to poisoning of Black and brown bodies. It leads to poisoning of poor people. I think that there are a lot of stories, not just about Black and brown bodies, but there are a lot of stories about how fracking in Pennsylvania has poisoned water supply. And that community was right next to, didn't know that they were next to, didn't know that they were in the vicinity of a very toxic emitter. And so, sometimes, in the water, it can be a lot more obvious in the air, because in the air, the public health effects take years, if people study it, to realize, well, cancer rates in this community are so much higher than this community. And it turns out also the wind blows in that direction, and upwind is this factory that is putting all this stuff into the air. So that Fenceline Communities report really, showed and demonstrated the public health effects of poor regulations.
Right. Right, that are rooted, of course, historically in racist beliefs,
Yeah.
and whether or not we are actively practicing, whether or not we perceive ourselves as racist or applying racist beliefs, they are often baked into how historically we have crafted policy measures.
And that's why I said it that way, because somebody will
Absolutely.
easily say, "Oh, I love black people. My TV's in color." Okay, like that's not impressive at all. And it is definitely worth saying that this is systemic racism. This isn't the overt, bigoted, easy to see on TV type racism. No, this is the way we've always done it type racism.
Right. Right, which is more pernicious, I think. So remember, folks, you can share your questions with us, and we do have a question urging us to get to the solutions bit. Stay with us; we're getting there.
Oh man, they want solutions.
They want it now. They want to know. But just let's wrap up this final point here. Again, we're talking about air pollution and where, it's a classic example of environmental injustice, and often it falls along racial lines. So just some really startling factoids I think are quite shocking for folks to learn. And there are many more. Here are a few that come to mind for me. African Americans in the US are 79% more likely than whites to live in neighborhoods with toxic industrial pollution that poses the greatest health danger. And that speaks exactly to what Tykee was just mentioning. It's a product of how we have cited those polluting industries. 2 million Americans live within 3 miles of the top 12 dirtiest coal power plants. 76% of those residents are people of color. And in a 29 report, researchers from University of Minnesota published the following. On average, and this was really shocking for me to hear, African Americans breathe in 56% more pollution than they generate, while whites breathe 17% less air pollution than they cause. So it's a pretty damning factoid to tie, I think, these environmental injustices specifically to this term environmental racism. I think it's pretty easily borne out, understood in those factoids. So, okay, pretty startling here. But let's move on to our next question, and it's sort of an offshoot of this conversation. When we last spoke, you connected this issue of environmental justice and environmental racism to criminal justice. Tell us what you mean by that, and maybe let's keep this kind of succinct. So that we can, sort of round this off, I think, in a clear manner. So help us understand how that environmental justice and criminal justice are related.
Well, the policy that we can pass today won't be able to retroactively address the environmental injustice that has happened. But there are potential legal remedies that can be sought where damages can be estimated and at least some type of compensation can be offered. I'm inspired by the class action lawsuit from the residents of Flint, Michigan to the government on poisoning their water supply back in 2014. I think that, mentioning the Environmental Rights Amendment in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to legitimize the constitutionality of that clause. And it is a matter of time. It is a matter of resources. But I think we have the right people. And I think this is the right time.
Inspiring words. I certainly hope so. A lot of people have been for too long disappointed on that matter, of course. So hopefully this is just the next turn or the first turn in a very long list of positive actions. Right. Okay, so political winds blowing in our favor here, and there's also, of course, a lot of social change afoot. And this speaks to this next question that we've lined up here. Speaks to, I think, some of the comments and questions that we're getting, and it's pivoting to talking about some of these solutions here. It gets back a little bit to the point about who's holding power and who's holding money. We had one comment come through that says, not to mention the majority of nonprofits that folks would donate to are led by white folks. Okay, so a lot of the environment and conservation organizations, Tykee, that you and I work with, that we've been employed by, are indeed led predominantly, overwhelmingly, by a single class of people. Okay, so you've learned a lot since over the past year, and certainly over your career since we last spoke over the past year. about how we can advance issues of racial equity and justice through our actions, particularly institutionally, but also individually.
Right.
Do you think that there's a formula you've come across for what works best?
When folks ask me, what can I do to help? I've answered the question in three ways. The first way is normalize how you demonstrate your values. No one should be surprised to hear that you believe Black Lives Matter. That is a floor, right? Two, and demonstrating your values can happen in a lot of ways, but when you normalize it, people shouldn't be surprised. All right? And that's on the individual level. Two, on an institutional level, so within your organizations, rationalize your rules. You have a code of conduct or an employee handbook, or you don't. And I think, and I challenge every organization to comb through with a fine tooth every word, every letter, every punctuation, and justify it. Can you justify everything that you have there? If you can, well, congratulations, you're perfect. And I want to know what you did because that would be nice. But where you cannot rationalize your rules, make opportunities to co-create, make opportunities to have a co-creative process in rulemaking. And then we are working against institutions that are institution of institutions. We're working against structures, and to dismantle those structures, we need to organize as people. And or when you organize as people, that can happen in a lot of ways. That can be a group chat. Anybody can start a group chat. That can be a union. Anybody can start a union. And what that calls for is bringing people together, being part of a movement, and building coalition. So again, what can I do to help? Normalize your values, rationalize your rules, and organize the people.
Awesome. It seems like the Tykee James playbook. We're going to have to get that engraved on the wall. But speaking to, of course, the need for institutional accountability, it's been, this conversation has been swept aside for a long, long time. And where I find it heartening is that social movements are pushing, and I'm going to talk specifically about STEM here, because of course that's the realm I'm coming from, but pushing STEM institutions to look inwards and have this reckoning. It's no longer acceptable, of course, in sort of the social zeitgeist to look beyond these issues anymore. So I certainly welcome that challenge, and I appreciate the call for holding our institutions and ourselves accountable.
All right.
So let's pivot a little bit to think about, we mentioned at the top of the hour here that we were going to address specific policies, either in the climate and land conservation realms, that can help us advance these issues of equity and justice within those areas, right? And so let's pivot to think more specifically about the field of land conservation policy, which is, again, specifically where you're working, and help us understand two things here. We have a question coming through, and I'd like to invite that. And so let me put my own rant on pause here. Remember, folks, you can send over your questions to myself and Tykee. And this question, Tykee, is: how can people defend themselves against government overreach? For example, local government enforces sewer installations in a rural area. Now residents' well water is tainted because of drilling and blasting. However, DEP, that stands for Department of Environmental Protection, will not help because the affected water is not a public water supply. So that one's in the weeds. But do you have any recommendations for this participant here?
Yes. Thank you for the question. First thing I want to hit on is I think your Boston came out a little bit when you were saying water. I think I heard a little bit. I was like, is that Mark Wahlberg?
Well, hey now, I try to keep it pressed. He's not the only one from Central Massachusetts. All right.
Okay. All right. I love it. That's the first thing. Second thing is, in order for whatever that source of pollution, wherever that's coming from, there needed to be a permit for that. Where you find that permit, I don't want to challenge, what you said, but it's incredible that the Department of Environmental Protection, in your contact with them, could not, bring a permit to this project, even if it's private. Water on the East Coast especially is seen as a public resource, a public good. And yeah, it's possible to have private things involved with it, but when it's causing issues like that, well, they needed permission to do that. Who gave them permission is my question. And then where whoever gave them that permission, I would I would seek to speak with them. And by seek to speak with them, I would bring my city council member, I would bring my state rep, I would bring my state senator, I would bring somebody from appropriations, because that's what funds these departments that have the capacity to permit and then enforce permits. And then when there are violations, conducting investigations. And then when you conduct those investigations, it makes it kind of easy to take those folks to court. It makes it easy to outline the issue and seek a remedy in in a simplified way. But that's
Okay.
on the face of the question.
Awesome. Thank you. So in general, for folks that maybe are familiar with, as this question asker is saying, government overreach, you mentioned going to their city council member perhaps is a good first step for sort of a blanket response here. Shall we say that?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on where the permission for that pipe came from. If it came from the city, talk to the city. If it came from the state, talk to the state. If it came from the federal government, talk to the federal government. And those folks who are elected to represent you represent those interests. So I would hope that they could, work with you and build power so that that can be addressed.
Awesome. Tykee, thanks for the insider tip here. So let's turn back to that federal scale question then. And I'll revisit the question I was posing initially. So you're working specifically in the field of land conservation policy. So tell us sort of two parts here. The first is land conservation we know can play a key role in tackling climate change. So this is sort of my selfish question. I'd like to hear you explain from a scientific standpoint, sort of succinctly, how land conservation helps us tackle climate change, and then help us connect that to why it can play an important role in specifically advancing environmental and climate justice.
Right. So I think the economy of the future that we need is an economy that is based on restoration. Ecological restoration based economy means we are valuing natural infrastructure strategies to mitigate the effects of climate and to absorb all the carbon that we're putting out into the world by planting trees. Land conservation is a very long way, I think, sometimes of saying planting, but making sure we're doing it with a purpose. Especially on the East Coast, there has been, the history of development of our cities, of our roads, had not considered land conservation, had not considered wildlife conservation until after the fact, that we're like, oh, actually, we cause problems that now we have to find a way to fix. While we're fixing those problems and we are recovering from the pandemic, as a country, I think that there's a lot of benefits in putting investments into land conservation plans, land conservation solutions that help us address the climate crisis and give people jobs.
Definitely. Yeah, I think folks are sometimes startled. It's almost as if they're looking for some magic new technology that is going to magically address environmental and climate degradation, and also fix these issues of injustice and environmental racism, when the solutions we need we already have. They just lie often outside of sort of this technical science playbook, right? They lie in, as you mentioned, job creation. So now we have to start thinking about those solutions that can fulfill some sort of scientific goal, but are also satisfying the needs of building economic prowess for particular communities,
right.
And create job creation.
And then I think it's worth saying too that land conservation, where we started, and I say we, I'm not necessarily part of that we, because that we that started land conservation were white landowning rich males that decided how and where and why we do things that are part of our country today. Some of the inspiration we should take, some of the lessons and what we should be resourced by, is inspiration and lessons from indigenous communities who have been born in this in this land that settlers only came to cause issues with. So I think that it land conservation means not just partnering but centering how indigenous communities need conservation done, because again, knowledge of the land, heritage of the land, and land recognition are just initial pieces of using land conservation to solve these bigger issues. So I think it definitely needs to be included and mentioned.
Definitely. And, sort of harkening back there to some of the forefathers, I shudder to use that term, but the forefathers of conservation science, a lot of those folks are now very well known, outright racist figures. A lot of folks sort of in their own personal and institutional doctrines describe conservation as an effort that should be done for the white race, quite literally, verbatim. And that's sort of an extraordinary example, of course, of how racist beliefs can make their way into practices. But Tykee, of course, as you mentioned, now it's maybe more subtle, and it's just baked into how we've always done things. And that's why if we don't flip it on its head now and call it what it is, we sort of stand to make those issues, make those historical mistakes again, or worsen their impacts now.
Right.
So we have a question come through. Let's see here. These are sort of generalized comments, sort of about climate impacts and climate change. This question asks, how do you distinguish between human-caused climate change and natural long-term climate change? So I love that question. I welcome it. We do have a lot of other programs, of course, where I've addressed that exact program.
Right.
And I want to make sure.
That's a great question.
I make the best of Tykee's time here. So I encourage you to check out some of our previous videos. And there's a comment here, of course, that in Texas, maybe a lot of folks didn't believe in climate change until they had some intense storms this week. And so we'll take a little diversion here to recognize, yes, climate change also means cold snaps. And unfortunately, Texas is feeling the brunt of that right now. But, this does, Tykee, we can relate that to our conversation. A lot of the impacts happening right now in Texas are due to, of course, power outages. And it speaks to sort of the aging infrastructure of our national grid system. So this is how electricity is distributed. And so, one of these solutions, these potential policy solutions for job creation that you just mentioned, is to help actually build out new electricity infrastructure in the US. And that is just one small part of a big list of executive orders that Joe Biden's administration released in late January. And you and I were chatting about that. It had a couple, I think, exciting aspects that I wanted to bring up, but I want to give you the opportunity to sort of, help us understand in general right now, what is the I guess, general characterization of some of that high level executive order type work that's coming out. Of course, that's not yet working its way through Congress. We'll see sort of how that all takes shape. But is there anything that is sort of on the forefront that you're particularly excited about, you've got your eye on?
That's a really great question. The Biden-Harris administration has done an incredible amount of work to do policy reviews with and a lot of administrative departments where not executive orders are necessarily needed, but executive orders really do help drive the mission of those departments to deliver on important campaign promises, but also more critically center advancing racial justice and social equity, as we started this conversation with. And everything I've seen, at least in regards to addressing the climate crisis, has been connected to jobs. And I think that has been one of the most pivotal and unfortunately one of the most influential arguments of environmental progress, that it doesn't create jobs. But that's a lie. I think that, if we are relying on the ways things have been done, then that is the answer to the question, that there is no way to solve it. But we cannot rely on the way things have been done, at least from our forefathers, as you say, or forefathers.
Man, I'm not going to invite you back for a third time now.
Representing everybody in the 617, right? I think, too, to the Texas issue, there is just so much reliance on fossil fuels that, there's the issue. There's so much political influence from the fossil fuel industry to say it should only be us. Texas is one of the fastest growing states in solar. And, I hope those folks are doing fine. I hope everybody in Texas is doing fine. But it's unfortunate that there are just policy obstacles to getting solar on roof panels or getting solar in communities. In Pennsylvania, facing the same political issues of just a very small legislative language that needs to be changed so that folks can have energy cheaper, reliable, cleaner, but the fossil fuel interests really make it difficult. I'm very appreciative too of executive orders that speak to the different ways we need to invest in energy, because yeah, it is about infrastructure, and I think it's also about energy storage, because we have zero storage. There's no, like, if you turn, as you see, you turn off the lights, there's backup generators, but that's not energy storage, you know. And I think what we can do to invest and revitalize that point will take some research. It will take some time. It will take some development. But I think that's a solution we can look for while we are focused on land conservation.
Yes, a worthy option. And in fact, we have another question from the audience. Tykee, what are the best practices in land conservation taken for granted by the public and practitioners that reveal systemic racism when we scratch beneath the surface and talk to underrepresented communities affected by these decisions? So it's kind of a big, bulky question. Let me know if you need me to read it again, but essentially eliciting here, what are those best practices in land conservation when we actually engage with those, maybe let's say some of those frontline communities and others that come up. What are they, and what are we missing, and what needs to be a part of the conversation here?
Interdisciplinary research needs to be a bigger part of our conversations. Naturalists need to be talking to mechanical engineers, need to be talking to cloud scientists, need to be talking to birders. And there's a way that, you know, a diversity of thought benefits intergenerational, multi-generational solutions. Deja Perkins, who, you know, she's the president of Black AF in STEM, and she actually lives in, went to a school in North Carolina, I believe. Anyway, she did this research on how eBird hotspots are disproportionately in affluent white areas, neighborhoods, parts of cities, and not so much where we would identify frontline and fenceline communities. I think that the way we observe wildlife informs how we value land. How we value land informs the policies we enact to protect it. And the policies that we have reflect our values. So there needs to be a list of people talking to each other about what they're seeing, what they're feeling, and what's happening. But because we've lacked that, because we've shut people out, because we chose to put problems here but solutions over there, keeping those two things separate, we have to do a lot of work to dismantle that. And to dismantle that, we got to break down barriers in communication. We got to be able to build more bridges between differences, and really and find that there aren't actually so many differences that put us apart. That in fact, there's a way to celebrate the diversity of all these disciplines. There's a way to celebrate the diversity of people in a way that can create unity, because it's that unity that we need to approach these solutions with. The hope is, I think, with land conservation, it informs how we build cities. It informs the issues of stormwater management and the issues of carbon sequestration.
Right. And that's a poignant thing to end on there, right? With projections for the global population, something on the order of 80% of the global population is expected to live in cities by mid-century. That's a stat, if I'm recalling it correctly, from the United Nations. And so this point that Tykee has made, of course, is it's not prescient. It's something that we need to be thinking about right now to be setting up for the coming decades, as we're seeing those overall trends of folks moving into cities. That's a really great point to end on, I think. Well, we are coming to our 40-minute mark here, and this is typically when I wind things down, although I could keep you on all afternoon.
I'm not doing anything.
But I want to thank everyone for submitting their questions. If you've got any last-minute questions in the last 5 minutes here, definitely share them out with us, and we'll sneak them in our last few minutes here. But Tykee, I guess, let us know what's coming up for you next on the docket here. I mean, we're having this conversation in the context of course, Black History Month, and we're celebrating contributors, Black contributors to the STEM fields and the communities that we work with, of course. And you hit on one really important feature there that we should be thinking about: community participatory research.
Right.
Was sort of the collective term for what you're describing there, to bring together some of those interdisciplinary fields.
Exactly.
So for any scientists watching along, definitely check that out. But how can, what's next? We're talking about history, being steeped in history, and using that to sort of springboard to a better future, right? What's next on the docket for you?
Well, I think folks should look for opportunities to organize with the City Nature Challenge, which something that can happen in every city, something I know is big in Philly, something that is big in DC, where I'm currently at, and that is part of that. Let's bring more people to observe wildlife. Let's bring more people to celebrate biodiversity, because biodiversity is a measure of habitat, healthy habitat, and it is also the way that I got involved in the conservation movement that led me to this job with Audubon, where I get to organize bird walks with members of Congress and congressional staff. Um, and something to look forward to is generational change in how we do jobs. I wanted to mention the Civilian Climate Corps is one of those executive orders that I'm really excited about, to see how that turns into something. And those can be careers for people who just start looking at wildlife, just start observing wildlife. Um, on a personal side, some of the projects that I have coming up, I recently launched Freedom Birders, which is initially it's going to start as an education project that's resourced by inspiration from the civil rights movement, including the Freedom Rides, including the Black Lives Matter movement, including Black Birders Week. And the hope, the true goal, the long-term goal, I should say, of it is we will trace the route of the Freedom Riders from DC to New Orleans as a trip that will connect land conservation and birds to the history of people and the history of the land that we're enjoying, that we typically enjoy when we're out birding, especially in the South. So there are ways to support that. You can check out Freedom Birders on Instagram and Twitter, or just look for me and I'll post about it. I think that there's a lot to look forward to in Black Birders Week this summer. No spoilers, I guess, but for me, I think that I might do a big week in DC, and a big week just means I bird every single day, all day, 7 days, like a marathon. And hopefully I can do that to raise some money, because I'm also on I'm the co-chair for the Black and Latinx Birders Scholarship Fund, where we raise money to give two $5,000 scholarships to any nationwide U.S. College or university. And you can check out more information about that, amplifythefuture.org. And I hope that what folks can also look forward to is rest and healing, because a lot has happened between this point and this point last year, or even 2 years ago. And it's easy to go from one Zoom meeting to another. It may be easy to go from one assignment to the next, but even robots need to reboot. You can't pour from an empty cup. So I hope folks can really look forward to deep healing, and that can look differently in a lot of different ways.
Awesome. Well, you said it best. I don't think I can say anything else to end us on. So I'll just recap. You mentioned amplifythefuture.org. You mentioned check out the Freedom Birders Instagram. And of course, you have your own personal message too. Is there a Twitter handle you want to share with us for folks to follow along?
Yeah, at Tykee James, or at
Tykee
Tykee_James on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Tykee. We covered a lot of ground today, and I think that there's plenty of learning that we all have to continue to do. Plenty of work that we're gearing up for to start and to continue moving forward. So, really appreciate you coming to share some of your own insight into this stuff, and we'll see about that third time around invite. You
right, third time
pushing your luck.
Third time is the charm. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Tykee. And thanks everyone at home for joining us today. As always, we're available, of course, via comment here on Franklin Institute. Check out all of those pages that Tykee just shared with us to support and follow along with this stellar work. Until next time, I am Rachel Valletta, your environmental scientist. We'll see you on Franklin Outside in another 4 weeks or so. Bye now.